Hey guys, welcome back once again. Today we're going to be installing some Whiteline Lowering springs and 12mm wheel spacers onto our Ford Focus RS. First thing, like always, you want to do is jack up the car with a floor jack and make sure to support on some nice jack stands. Pop the hood open so we can remove the small covers on the cowl, followed by the protective grommets on the wiper arms. Now we can remove the 15mm nuts on the wiper arms themselves. When doing this part, be real careful not to damage the wiper arm or the windshield. You're just going to work the arm back and forth and it's going to pop right off. With these now off, we can take the T30 screws off from both the corners of the cowl and the 4 plastic clips. Carefully pop out the cowl so you can access the two 10mm bolts holding the metal trim piece covering the strut bolts. Move onto your wheels and remove them out of the way. You're going to remove this 8mm bolt attaching the brake hose to the strut. Also go ahead and unclip the wheel speed sensor from both of its clip-on points. Using a 15mm ratcheting wrench and a 5mm Allen key, you're going to remove the swipe bar link off from the strut. Where the bottom of the strut meets the knuckle, there's a 15mm bolt that needs to be removed to free the strut, but you will need to reuse that same bolt by running it in on the opposite side where the threads are, and run it while having something flat where the knuckle split so that the bolt can push up against it and open the knuckle enough for the strut to come out with minimal effort. We just smacked it down with our foot and got it down enough where one of us could push down and the other will move the strut out of the way. Unclip the adaptive suspension sensor and remove the small cover to get to the rest of the sensor wiring. Unbolt these three 13mm bolts, which will allow you to remove the strut completely off from the vehicle. This is the spring compressor we are going to be using today, which can be rented at any parts store. Grab the spring holders and put them on the spring on opposite sides of each other. Make sure to lock them down. You don't want these flying off and killing you. Just ask my neighbor's dog, rest in peace Shadow. With the holders in place, run them slowly down until the spring comes free inside of the strut. This step is optional, but we cut a cheap deep socket 18mm with a grinder about an inch so we can remove the top nut on the top of the strut. To hold the strut mount from moving, reinstall one of the 13mm bolts and use it to hold it in place. With the nut off, remove the strut mount and its dust cover. And just like that, the spring is ready to be removed from the shock. Swap the spring compressor holders from the old one onto the new Whiteline spring. When installing the spring, make sure the spring sits on the small groove for it at the bottom of the rubber insulator. With the spring sitting down, reinstall the dust cover and the strut mount on the shock. Just like on the bottom, make sure the end of the top of the spring lines up with this angle part of the strut mount. Install the strut mount nut back down and tighten it down. Just like when you removed it, use the 13mm bolt to go against it so the nut can be tightened down. Again, don't forget to make sure the spring is aligned correctly. And now you can remove the spring compressor holder. Now it's all ready to go back in. Make sure you get the connector in first. This is also a good time to call over a friend and ask him for a hand, otherwise you might be here all day. One of you pushes down on the knuckle while the other pushes the strut back in. Line up the top three 13mm bolts and run them down. Put the sensor back in and make sure the strut is sitting flush on the knuckle. Now you can tighten down the 15mm bolt on it. Reinstall the swipe bar link and the wheel speed sensor back in. Tying down the 8mm bolt for the brake hose bracket. And just as easy as that, you're done. Now before we put the wheel back on, we're going to install our brand new 20mm wheel spacer. Make sure after running down the nuts on the spacer, you torque them down to specs. We did 100 foot-pounds, and that's what Ford recommends on their manual. Now the wheel can go back on. This goes a lot faster if you have 3 hands. Just snug them down so we can set the front of the vehicle back on the ground. Reinstall the metal trim piece covering the strut bolts and tighten them down. We can pop the cowl back in and tighten down the T30 plus the 4 clips. Last thing we need to do is put these small covers back on and put the wiper arms back into place. Make sure you put them back in the same position you took them off. With the front completely done, we can move on to the rear. Same thing as before, jack it up and make sure to put it on some nice jack stands. Remove the back wheels. Then slide that same jack at the bottom of the rear control arm. With the arm supported, remove this 15mm bolt attaching the arm to the knuckle. Slowly lower the jack, and just like that, the spring comes right off. All you need to do before installing the new Whiteline spring is swap over the top rubber insulator, making sure the spring is aligned, and then put it back into the lower control arm. With the spring into place, raise the lower control arm. Now with the control arm back up, put the bolt back in, tighten it down, and you're done. Only thing left to do is install the rear wheel spacers and the wheels themselves. Lower the rear end and make sure to ground to each wheel and torque them down to specs. Ford recommends is 100 foot-pounds. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you guys around. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.